Apparently, companies are dying to get workers in the door. Yet, if you're like me, when I heard this messaging when I first got out of college, despite every news outlet out there stating something like, companies can't hire enough workers, it felt like every time I put in my resume, I was being rejected constantly. So clearly, companies wanted workers, but no company wanted me. Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Ben Rogajan, aka the Seattle Data Guy. Today's focus, I'm going to talk about how I got my first job in data engineering. And I want to specify, this is my first job in data engineering, not my first job kind of in data. Before that, I was kind of in the data analyst or BI kind of field. So I eventually pushed over to data engineering. And I want to kind of set up how I got there, everything from how I studied to the interview process to even like the first days of the job and how I went from more of like a data operations engineer at the place to a data engineering developer. So where I was actually building new infrastructure and code. That way, whether you're someone trying to get your first data engineering job or you've gotten your first data engineering job and you'd like to kind of figure out how to grow in it, this video will have that answer. So let's dig into it. If you're like me and watched episode 48 of Naruto, you definitely immediately connected with Rock Lee and his whole kind of mentality, where you'd often have to rely on just pure hard work and determination to just push through any challenge, which was exactly what I would have to do for interviews. So in order to get ready for interviews, I basically set up a whole gauntlet of interview questions, both on like the SQL, coding, data warehousing side. I put together guides for myself. I did just about everything I could to get myself ready for all of the interviews I was hoping to get. I actually only ended up getting 2 interviews at this stage in my life. One at Amazon and one at a company called Healthentic. The first one was Amazon, and similar to the fight with Gara, I was nowhere near ready for Amazon and immediately got thrashed in the first round. You can watch more on that. If you're curious on how that interview went with me and Amazon, I actually put a video together for that, so I'll link it above. But I quickly found myself outmatched and outwitted by Amazon's questions and honestly walked away with my tail between my legs and felt really bad after this interview. It definitely does not feel good when you go through the whole process of studying, working hard, feeling like you're asking yourself all the right questions and preparing in all the right ways, only to have the very first question throw you for a loop and have no good answer for it. But of course, at this point, I couldn't just merely give up. I had more interviews to go. Well, in this case, one more interview to go. So I studied again a little more and went to this interview with my head held high. Now, of course, I was nervous, but I had studied all that I could. Again, everything from SQL to programming to data warehousing questions, I was pretty ready for it. And like most interviews, there was some form of screening interview early on that I'd kind of gotten through. And now was the time for the on-site interview. What kind of questions did they ask, you're wondering? Well, it really was a combination of data warehousing and SQL questions, really. Like they asked the kind of classic question, explain to me different types of joins, which if you can't answer at this point, you have a lot more studying to go in the whole world of data engineering, because that is kind of a baseline question just to make sure you understand SQL. So of course I explained the different joins, kind of an inner join, full outer join, as well as like a left join. Obviously there's a right join, but that doesn't exist for most of us. They did also have a few SQL questions that they had printed out that I then had kind of written out the answer for. Kind of your standard set of questions. I always find that most SQL interview questions will involve something of the nature of an aggregate question, maybe an aggregate question with a filter, maybe one question that requires an analytical function. And if not an analytical function, a self-join. Like I always have that joke. Like anytime I am the interviewer and there's a self-join, I always have to say the cliche line of, can we do it without a window function? Because it's almost a instant response to use something like a lag or a lead when you're doing interviews, because it's so much faster, or at least mentally less taxing to just write a lag, lead, row number or something similar rather than putting together a self join. But I always find that that question exists in a lot of SQL interviews. So if you're getting ready for SQL interviews, I recommend always being ready to aggregate, do some sort of self join, and make sure you understand filters. That's like baseline. There's obviously a lot of other things you can get asked, but that's kind of a good baseline. From there, you can focus on other things like how do you create metrics with SQL? How do you actually make sure you do like case statements inside of sums and things of that nature. Back to the interview, I was then asked about like how would I explain a data warehouse to someone that was like 5, and I did my best to explain, a data warehouse and then maybe design one as well. This is a pretty classic question that you will almost always be asked in most DE interviews, which is, put together a pretty straightforward Snowflake schema or star schema data warehouse. Be glad they don't ask you about like what's the difference between like Inmin and Kimball, because that would destroy most of us, because I think most people do a lot of Kimball style data warehousing and then maybe some of you don't even know who Inman is. I will be honest, I don't recall if they asked me any coding questions at this point. They might have. If it was, it must have not been that significant. And I do find that coding is kind of hit or miss for data engineers. Oftentimes, this depends on the company and the role. If they have a lot of coding in general, for example, like Facebook, they will have a coding interview, but Amazon, when I interviewed with them later on, had no coding interviews whatsoever. They only really asked me questions that were like SQL or database based. So make sure you know what you're going to be asked before you go into an interview. After I wrapped up with this interview, they kind of showed me around the office and actually let me meet the CEO. This was a very small company. It was only about, I think at that point, like 12 people. So it was a very small company. They had several products that were decently successful and made an actual income. So they didn't actually need a huge team, and they weren't like in a growing phase. It was more of kind of like growing, but like maintenance phase. So I got to meet the CEO. I think we talked a little bit, and then I went on my way. I think it was a few days later where they called me back and offered me the job. And at this point, I was very ecstatic and took it. Of course, then I had to think about, how was I going to make this job different? Like, how was I going to stand out? And this is where I really tried to like push and drive everything I had when I first started. One of the questions I constantly am asked in a lot of FANG interviews, as well as I think even others, is, what will you do in your first 90 days after starting this job? And usually they're looking for you to have some sort of ability to kind of take ownership of things, as well as maybe try to do some self-learning if you've got gaps, which is exactly what I did at this job. So early on in this job, I basically tried to glean everything about this company that I could. I went through every code base. I went through every line. I learned as much as I could about Oracle because we were using Oracle. And I really just dug deep into these systems. And I was like thinking about like ways to improve this company. And I was using every little bit of my brain, like I think it was like 24-year-old brain, and my limited wisdom in terms of like setting up systems and setting up better solutions to try to solve these problems. Because at this point, I was more of a data operations engineer, which, just to explain kind of what we did, we really just loaded data into the system. It was a pretty like semi-manual process where we would get files in and we would go through some pre-processing and then loading and then checking of the data to make sure it worked. So really all I was doing was running commands that were very standard. It was some command, some file name, some other, I think, data information if I recall, and it was pretty standard. And that's when my brain had a semi-brilliant idea. Because of the fact that we were replicating the same steps over and over again, my brain, being as brilliant as it was at 24, was like, well, why don't we build a system to try to manage this? And at that point, I was trying to spend a lot of time learning Spring Framework with Java. So I built a whole website basically to focus on loading this data and then giving you information about it. Kind of like a very basic Airflow UI. Please stop recreating Airflow, people. I then went to the director of engineering at the time and kind of showed them the product. And I was like, hey, look at this. Like, what do you think? What are your thoughts? And in their wisdom, they obviously looked at it and they're like, wow, this has a lot of extra infrastructure that you'd have to keep up. So no, this is not a good idea for a long-term solution. But what they did also see was like, hey, this guy actually knows at least enough about code to put together this thing. And we don't really have someone that does straight like coding development currently. And so then they were like, well, can you look through all of our infrastructure and can you help us support these new projects that we're trying to develop? And so that's when I went more from being more of a data operations person, kind of loading data, to taking on a lot more code. Like I was actually getting to build different components and it was really fun. I got to learn a lot about kind of trying to develop new components and modules in systems. I learned how to think a lot more systematic about things versus just trying to answer like one question at a time. It's very easy as an engineer to just try to create one solution. But if you don't think about the big picture and the rest of your system and how all these different components interact with each other, you're going to have a really hard time. This is actually where I felt like I built a lot of the foundation of what I know today in terms of trying to think a little bit bigger picture as well as, system design, because I was constantly challenged at this job, being a little bit younger than most of the other people there and clearly less experienced because I would occasionally make design decisions that were not the greatest. But I was really glad to be kind of surrounded by people that helped support me, build me up, and really help me grow like in this whole space of data engineering, as well as just design in general. While I was spending a ton of time learning about this company, kind of the different components, as well as like building products and systems in general, I also spent a ton of my free time learning more about data warehousing, as well as ETLs, ELTs, and all these other different concepts that exist in data engineering. Because up until this point, I really only had pieces of what a data engineer was. Like I never really put a concept or word to the data pipelines I was building. I was really just building things like SSIS jobs and maybe some coding based data transformations and processes, but I never really put a word to this whole process. And so this is really where I started getting all of these different things that I'd learned, a little bit about ETLs, a little bit about data warehousing, and a few other components like data modeling. And I started to just put it all together and finally kind of come into my own, I think, in data engineering. So it was a really long process. When I first started out, again, I was more of an analyst at a different company, moving into a data engineering role, doing a lot of programming, doing a lot of understanding of like how to set up dependencies, especially when you don't have like a library or a framework that does dependency management, as well as setting up things like metadatabases and all these other components that, again, data engineers do a lot of. And many of you have even asked, what do I mean when I say data pipelines and all of that? And all this information and all these concepts were, just like to you now, estranged to me. I didn't actually know what they meant. They were just kind of things that I did or processes that I set up that weren't always set up well when I initially started because I didn't have the full picture. And that is something I think we all develop over time. But because data engineering as a concept, as a job, as a role, isn't really taught in school, I think it does take a lot of time to really formulate what a data engineer does and come into your own as a data engineer. So even if your goal is to become a data engineer by the end of this year or next year, it is a continual journey because you're going to be constantly learning things and having new people define kind of what a data engineer does over and over again. So I don't want you to be discouraged if you don't get the first data engineering job you interview for. Take some time, reflect, use the free time to study and try to improve your skills, because when the opportunity does arise, you might find a company that is willing to work with you, that is willing to kind of help you grow in your position, especially if it's more in the startup range, and especially if you're willing to give that company a little bit of your time. So if your goal in 2022 is to become a data engineer, I recommend do a little bit of everything. Again, you're going to spend some time studying, spend some time networking, spend some time interviewing if you can, submitting resumes. And once you finally get those first few interviews, do your best at them, of course, but don't be too discouraged if you do poorly. You never know when you'll have a job offer. And once you start that new job, and especially if you're new, take some time to really learn their infrastructure. That's a great way to, one, look at code that was written before you, see if it was good, see if it was bad, see what you change about it, and really start learning and coming into your own as a data engineer. Hopefully this video was helpful for you guys out there who are trying to become data engineers, or for those of you who are already data engineers, hopefully it's somewhat of a reflective video that you can look back at your own experiences. Whatever it might be, if you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to maybe share this with your friends. And with that, guys, I will say goodbye and have a wonderful day.